And good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Speakeasy Reviews. Today we are going to be reviewing National Treasure. Is it a good film? And Dixon, how are you doing this week?
I'm doing fine. I'm drinking my caffeine here, so I am ready to unload on this movie, which is most definitively not a good film.
Well, let's introduce it with the only way that I know how, which is a silly clip.
Oh, look at Nicolas Cage. He made many horrible movies. Snake Eyes, 8mm, Gone in 60 Seconds, Captain Corelli's Mandolin, Wind Talkers, Ghost Rider, Family Man, Weatherman, Wicker Man, Bangkok Dangerous. But then he nailed it, Stan, with National Treasure 2, the greatest movie of all time.
So, National Treasure. Now, that was two. That was the only funny clip I could find with National Treasure. And the reason I think that's the only National Treasure joke I can find is because it is actually quite an enjoyable film, and it's very hard to trash it.
No, that is not correct. First of all, it commits the mortal sin of starring Nicolas Cage.
Let's talk about Nicolas Cage first, because if you were to ask me, I paid attention.
Shall I put on my Nicolas Cage voice?
So when I watch this film, I think he actually does it. The reason I think he does a good job of this, so I think this is actually a good example of Nicolas Cage as a good actor, because he's not playing the Nicolas Cage character he plays in every shit film, with the exception of Sergeant Whatever's Mandolin, where he has that awful Italian accent, or Con Air, where he has that awful Southern drawl of some sort. In this film, it's a fairly understated performance, and I think it's actually quite a good performance. And I was ready to be critical of that, because that's what I was looking for. I can't really fault his performance in this film, whether you like it or not.
I was ready to shut this movie off in the first 10 minutes. I didn't, because I committed to you to see this through to the end. But that sequence at the opening in the Charlotte, the boat,
yes,
that is implausibly preserved in ice or whatever, and there's gunpowder that works, which is so stupid. I can't even, but whatever. All right, it's a plot device. I've learned to let these things go in my old age, generally. But when he sits down to work his way through the clue that's left and starts doing this Nicolas Cage thing where he, this means the signing of this is on the back and it's a clue, and it's all so ridiculous. Like no human being would ever do what he does or go through the sequence that he does. I am not convinced, because he's got that California surfer accent, which is his default natural accent. You know, he's the nephew of Francis Ford Coppola, so he grew up out there. He grew up in the, in the world of privilege and all that stuff in Hollywood. And I'm supposed to be buying him as this like idiosyncratic genius who reads an obscure rhyming clue and works through it, and all I can hear, I mean, the only way this could have been more ridiculous is if it were Keanu Reeves. That's it. You know what I mean? Like,
it's the accent, isn't it?
It is the accent. The accent is it works okay in Raising Arizona because he's supposed to be a doofus.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. Agree. But outside of that, I have never seen a movie like where he's supposed to be like this driving, action / intellect that moves the plot along. Like, no, it does not work for me. And yeah, I mean, we could talk about it further. I mean, the movie is much too silly to be any good. But
I want to, because I would agree that the most, I would say the most ridiculous quote scene. Now, we haven't researched gunpowder. I don't know that gunpowder freezing. That's something we could Google. I don't know that there's.
Well, it's that it would get moist because it's like ice,
But it's dry. It's in the middle. It's absolutely dry there.
Yeah, but like the surface ice will like melt every year, and like water will, back and forth and back and forth. No.
Well, I don't think you know enough about where the Charlotte was found to know if that surface ice was dry. But what I think
it's catastrophically stupid. But honestly, if that were the only thing, I wouldn't even bring it up. I would be like, fine, willing suspension of disbelief.
I'm going to preface this because I'm not comparing these films. I'm going to use a different franchise as an example to give it some grace, because the one thing that I like about this film is the writers do have a bit of an affinity towards history, and there's a lot more things in the film that it builds this narrative off of that are the foundationally true. And the one thing I will say is, if, let's say, the Charlotte bothers you, we can look at Indiana Jones, and I love Indiana Jones. That is one of my favorite film franchises.
Who doesn't?
And there are equally a number of absolutely ridiculous things that actually have less affinity towards history.
I knew
than
you'd
National
bring
Treasure.
this up. I knew you would bring this up because, it's the obvious comparison. This is
the only
trying
comparison.
to. It's derivative. It's entirely derivative, right? It's trying damnedest to be Indiana Jones for 2000.
Well, John
whatever
Turteltaub
it came
actually
out
said
for.
he loved Indiana Jones and he loves American history, and he was trying to build sort of a film, an homage to sort of both of those. He wanted to be something that was sort of an Indiana Jones meets a bit of a history piece.
And I can sort of appreciate that. The problem is he copied the wrong one. He copied Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Crusade, yeah.
It enjoys a very solid reputation, but that is a movie that's really running on fumes.
So Last Crusade, though, I would consider that which is going to be the popular commercial option, my favorite Indiana Jones to watch.
See, and that's a lot of people say that, and it's and I understand, because it's the first one, believe it or not, that I saw, and if there had been no others, and that were the only one, it would be great, and it's really well done. But as you say, if you start going through nitpicking historical elements, I mean, that movie's ridiculous. It's as ridiculous as National Treasure, right?
But National Treasure, the issue with that being ridiculous isn't the premise of the National Treasure 2, if you ever watch this, is way more ridiculous. But the actual history it's founded on, or a lot of the things that it talks about, are actually quite true, like 222 on the clock. But it's the one thing that I will say is decadent is the fact that the founding fathers, to protect the treasure, go to the steps that they go to. Why would they have clues that would lead people, who are smart enough to figure it out to find the treasure if they're trying to hide it in the first place? And I think that would be the most problematic part of the film, in my opinion.
The whole premise is stupid. But yes, the whole build-up, the notion that the treasure is this thing that's passed around from one king to another, from the Knights Templar to the Masons, who have nothing to do with one another, absolutely nothing.
But this film doesn't invent that type of thinking. I mean, my wife and I watch a TV show we really quite like called the Curse of Oak Island on History Channel, and I don't know if you've ever seen it or heard of it.
No.
It's actually quite an endearing show. The guys on it bought this island, or bought property on this island, and there's a lot of history. Even I think Theodore Roosevelt had spent time treasure hunting on this island, because there's all these theories and maps, and it's treasure hunting for, is it the Ark of the Covenant? Is it, whatever it is? It's all of these theories, and they're trying to find treasure. And I think National Treasure is sort of trading on this cottage industry of conspiratorial / Freemason treasure hunters. I mean, it's not National Treasure didn't invent this. This is something that's been around for ages.
I don't think that. Yeah, of course not. No, it didn't. I never said that. Listen, again, this movie is unabashedly, on one level, it's a shut your brain off, and just have fun.
Yeah,
and I get that. I personally am not oriented to those kinds of films. That is not what I consider to be fun, is shut my brain off. It would really have to be like, if you're going to do that, I actually find it more, move it into the entirely fantastical, doing
Big
it
Trouble
within
in Little China,
or that, or Star Wars, or Independence Day, or something where, well, I mean, Independence Day is stupid too, but Independence Day, listen, the premise is aliens show up from wherever to do nefarious things. You don't have to, right from the jump. We're not worried about reality. You know what I mean? We're not worried about, any kind of historical whatever. The idea of historical fantasy is, it's as old as Shakespeare, or probably older still. You could argue that, certainly Macbeth, King Lear. These are semi-historical, semi-mythological characters. In the case of Macbeth, semi-historical. In the case of Lear, semi-mythological. And so, using the notion of historical figures in a loosey-goosey way to make a point is very, very old. And I love the Shakespearean histories, and most of them are very ahistorical in many respects. So it's not that. I will say it's not my favorite genre when Hollywood does it, because Hollywood usually, like in this movie, this is just popcorn. It's just pure popcorn. But again,
this is a Disney film. And I didn't realize this. John Turteltaub, he also produced Cool Runnings, which I can see a connection between these two films.
Interesting. I've never seen that, and I'll bet it's good.
It is incredible. I would say Cool Runnings is very much along those lines. I think but that's really kind of vaguely following the story of something that really happened. Because I remember the Jamaican bobsled team actually being a thing. Yeah, and it's a dramatized version of sort of that story.
Right.
And I think people, and I think you have quite a fairly, I think your views are not isolated. If you look at the reviews on IMDb, Rotten Tomatoes, they're not very good. But also at the same time, when you do read reviews on the film, they're actually quite complimentary as far as it is a fun film if you're willing to just sort of kind of get lost in it. And I think what it's doing, it's doing something that we haven't seen many films do with American history. I can't think of many films that are to this degree using this sort of I guess leaping point for a fantasy film, which is what it is. And for me, and there's a bias here, because and what I said to you is this film is a film about every school trip we ever went on as a kid. And I think there's an element where I appreciated that.
Well, I mean, listen, I realized that to sit here and pontificate about historical accuracy in this film is to miss the point entirely. Right. I mean, and if that's what you're going to do, then, it's, you're not meeting the film on its terms.
I don't think the film is that ridiculous, and so the storyline is.
I don't think the film is good on its own terms.
So when I talk about the reason I think this film's good is I watched it again. I've probably watched it about 8 or 9 times. Okay. And watching it again last night, I didn't I would say I enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed. We reviewed Jurassic Park 3. I would say I enjoyed it as much as Jurassic Park 3.
I can't say that by the end, like I said, I really wanted to turn it off after the first 10 or 15 minutes, because Nicolas Cage was at like peak Nicolas Cage in a scene that I felt was ridiculously, even for what it's supposed to be. I'm like, no, I'm not buying. Like, this is just not buying it. But after that, I'll say that it sort of calmed down. Sort of. I mean, the idea of a heist, turning into a heist movie to steal the Declaration of Independence. Don't think about it too much, because, even again, on its own terms, they kind of give you a sort of or what's supposed to feel like an elaborate show of all the different steps they're taking to make this work and how it's going to work. If you allow your brain to be on during any part of that sequence, the first question that will come to mind is, how does Sean Bean's character happen to show up at the exact right time? You know what I mean? Like that's so would you already off the bat, it's very dumb.
Would you say that's any more or less ridiculous than, let's say, Ocean's 11?
I've never seen Ocean's 11, but Ocean's 11, and I say this having never seen it, I mean, I think like that movie was sort of, it's barely a movie is sort of my impression of that film, in that it's even the original I have seen, the one with Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack. And, you could tell in that movie that the plot is like, secondary to the idea, like, aren't we all super cool and we're hanging out, making a movie together. And the audience is supposed to, like, what you're supposed to get out of it is almost like, I get to hang out with this crew of people for a couple of hours, and like I'm in on the joke just by being here and watching this thing.
The vehicle was the cast. That was the entire. I went into that film to sort of digress onto Ocean's 11, wanting to dislike it, because I thought they've just bought themselves a popular film. They've invested in the coolest actors in the world. But I walked out of that film thinking, yeah, I really enjoyed that.
Well, I mean, if you get 7 or 8 very, very charming people together and make it about doing something that everybody would love to do, rip off a casino, hey, what's not to like? I actually think that, having not seen the remake, I would imagine that it works better than this film, because this film takes itself just enough seriously that you're supposed to. It's not about the cast; it is about the idea of this special treasure being. I think my favorite part. Well, my actual favorite part of this film was the very end, where she draws him a map to her vagina. That's hilarious. Like, what the hell? But my second favorite part was how they walk into Trinity Church on, right off of Wall Street. Which, have you ever been there?
No.
I have been down to there because I was going to an office that was right there. The idea that you'd walk in off the street into that church and there'd be no one there. You just go in and do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Is so and you just march down into the catacombs and whatever. Well, anything like that. It was just.
Well, even in Independence Hall, unfurling the actual Constitution when they're in between tour, you know that you've been there. It's not just tours that are in and out of there. There's just people constantly milling through there.
I guess. I mean, like, that one actually, that's like your classic movie trope that, like, you get in line for the tour and then at a key moment when the tour turns the corner, you like step away. It's been done in so many different movies. And, in that kind of film, like, I've definitely been through Independence Hall, like on an off day when it's not that crowded, where it's not totally outside the realm of plausibility that you could hang back and sort of like get lost. And it's also not that big of a place. What they actually show you of it. You see the first floor, you go upstairs, you see the second, they have a little thing, and then that's pretty much it. Like boom, 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 boom. But walking into, like, the Trinity Church is a functioning church, but also it's a famous church, because it's spoken of so often in literature and things like that. The idea that it's not that they go in and they have to they go in and there's nobody there. They can march around and do whatever the hell they want, including walk through a tomb, go down into catacombs that are that would be the craziest public. You want to talk about, forget that it would cost the treasure to build the catacombs that they build underneath that place. It's insane.
It would be insane that nobody would know about that too. That nobody would have any concept of. And I'm not beyond. I like this film, but I'm not beyond being critical of the absolute ridiculousness. I would do the same thing with any film. And this was really problematic if you ever watch National Treasure 2, because in National Treasure 2 they find a similar network under Mount Rushmore.
Okay.
And what they did was to find this, like, one of the clues. And what I like about the film is the way they string together this fantasy of clues with, let's say, reality or with history, and create this sort of series of events. And I think the way they do it, I quite like the way they do it. I'm willing to suspend belief, but what I will say is, in National Treasure 2, that one of the clues is they had to pour water on the stone at the top of Mount Rushmore, and they had to find like a bird. So when they wet the stone, it makes this different shade of rock turn into a bird, and they find it and they push what is a button in the rock, I think. And it opens up this door about 100 feet down by the sea. And I was just thinking, if that was last opened 200 years ago, what are the chances that that thing is going to work as easily as it does? I have an attic that doesn't open if I don't open it in about, let's say 3 months. It gets stuck. I can't imagine some sort of a rock-faced door on some sort of a spring system that goes undetected under the head of Mount Rushmore all of a sudden works when you put your foot onto it. So I'm not beyond being critical of some of the fantastical leaps it makes.
Right. Well, listen, and again, I hate to nitpick at the obviously fantastical elements, because fine, it's supposed to be a fantasy. Again, willing suspension of disbelief is fine. My biggest problem, and I started to say, and I don't want to forget this thought, because again, the obvious comparable is Indiana Jones, but as you point out, and I point out, that it's Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which is the most popular film, I agree, mostly because of the character interaction between Harrison Ford and Sean Connery, Indiana Jones and his father. And it is, all that stuff is really very good. But if you actually, could set that aside or distill that, and it does. I mean, the two of them carry that film in a way that you said, like your point to me coming into watching this thing is that Nick Cage will do essentially for National Treasure what Harrison Ford and Sean Connery did for Indiana Jones.
Well, no. I never even came close to saying
no, you never said that. But what you said was that Nicolas Cage carries this National Treasure film. And what I'm telling you is you're
connecting 2 points that I have not
connected. No. Well, no. And
I didn't even say carry. I said he.
I'm saying that you said that Nicolas Cage would carry this film. And because the plot is silly and it's a shut your brain off kind of thing, you have to latch on to something, because if you start latching on to the details, the whole thing is going to fall apart real fast. So it does require, is my point, a movie like this requires some pretty charismatic and interesting performances. Now, I will say that Nicolas Cage, in the end, annoyed me less in this movie than he typically does. And I will further say that he and Diane Kruger had a little something going on. Like she was sort of interesting, as much as is kind of silly that this person who has spent her entire life as a documentarian, after about 20 minutes of being kidnapped, is willing to throw her entire career and everything away, over. But setting that aside, they had a little chemistry. It was kind of working, it was all right. Riley Poole or whatever, the Justin Barton
in it. I thought his character was funny.
I think it was a little forced. He was kind of annoying.
It was very Disney.
Yeah. I mean, listen, it's a children's movie, right? But if you're looking at that, it's a triumvirate, right? Those three as carrying the film. Then you look at Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Now, what's her name? Elsa. The German chick is basically a throwaway in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, and she's actually almost literally thrown away at the end of that film. And then you have the two heavy hitters in Sean Connery and Harrison Ford, but the two of them are incredible. So otherwise, the films are very similar, right? They're basically remaking Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, but swap out Grail mythology / made up stuff for Declaration of Independence mythology / made up stuff. Down to the idea that the Knights Templar are involved in all that. It's a very similar film, almost blow for blow. And what I'm saying is that Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is the last gasp of, and the only reason that movie works is because of those actors. If you took out Sean Connery from that film, it wouldn't work as well as Raiders of the Lost Ark. Raiders of the Lost Ark is a tremendous film. Tremendous.
And that's the thing. I think commercially, so if I were to say what is the best film in that franchise, the one I seem to enjoy watching the most is Last Crusade. But I would actually say, and I know this is counterintuitive, that Last Crusade is Raiders of the Lost Ark is a better film than Last Crusade.
Well, I don't think that's counterintuitive, because I often say that I probably enjoy watching the first Star Wars film, most of the original three movies. Yeah. But The Empire Strikes Back is the best of the films.
Better film, and that I think most people would agree with that. One thing I will say though is what I enjoy about National Treasure, I'm happy with Nicolas Cage. I think he does a good job. I think the cast is John Voight. I thought was pretty good in National Treasure as well. His character as the father. And his sort of contribution, I thought it was decent, but I like how they strung together the history and the fantasy, and I just liked following where the clues went. It is a mindless thing, but I don't think it was that shit really. If you were to ask me where they strung and how they wrote the clues out, and where it went and how it was I guess choreographed from start to finish, I enjoyed it. I found it enjoyable.
I mean, I will say that again. I liked it. Like is not the right word, but I didn't. I watched it all. I put up with it. I got all the way to the end, and I actually lost the impulse to turn it off. I'm like, I'll go along with this, for till it's end. So does that mean it's good? I mean, on one level, there's nothing wrong with it. I guess I would put this. I mean, there's nothing wrong. There's plenty wrong with it. But what I would say is, I'd put it as like, I've seen it. I never need to see it again. But I can understand why, if I were a kid and I saw this, I would think it was a good movie.
Or a grown ass man like me.
But you know what I mean. Like if I were of that, if Raiders of the Lost Ark came out, or no, excuse me, Temple of Doom. Nope, I'm gonna get it right. Eventually I'll get it right. Last Crusade came out when we were 11, 12 years old, and I think that movie always will have a certain level of, although I saw that one a few years after it came out. It came out the same year as Batman, which always blows my mind, because Batman I saw in the theater and Last Crusade I didn't. But that one will always have sort of a nostalgia thing for me. If I were 13 and I saw National Treasure, I probably would have the same sentimentality for the film. What I know about it as someone who did not see it when he was 13 is that it is largely copying The Last Crusade. In terms of tone, in terms of even plot devices, the idea that you're kind of going. I mean, Indiana Jones: The Last Crusade, I remember reading a review of it once that talked about how it's a follow the numbers adventure.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what it is. And this does the exact same thing. We go from clue to clue to clue to clue to clue in ways that are, it's like basically watching a scavenger hunt.
That's what I think that's a good analogy. Very well.
Yeah. And, it's fine. For what it is, something to take the kids to in the summer, get out of the heat, go and sit in an air-conditioned theater, and it's inoffensive. It's inoffensive, but it's not like Raiders of the Lost Ark. I mean, that's to me the comparison point for all such films, because Raiders of the Lost Ark takes, again, I mean, to a degree, Raiders of the Lost Ark is also a scavenger hunt, except that material got elevated by superior direction, and the thing that really, that I remember annoys my sister about the film, but that really actually separates it from both its sequels and other imitators, is the temptation, of course, in any movie like this, is to find the thing at the end. That's the climax, whether it's the treasure or the Holy Grail or the third stone and the stones for Temple of Doom or any one of its a million imitators. You find the thing at the end.
Yeah.
They find the ark in the middle of the film. But that is classic, dramatic structure. The climax comes in the center of the film. And then you have falling action that leads to the second climax, because of course the ark allows for this, because it's not just finding the ark as an object in and of itself, it's opening the ark, and what is the ark inside, and then it raises all those kinds of existential questions. And then the brilliance of the ending of that film to me cannot be overstated. The idea that you after all of that, it becomes something that gets lost. It's God and all of God's glory somehow reified into a single object, the Ark of the Covenant, and it's so magnificently holy and therefore also beyond man's ability to comprehend or really deal with, that the only thing they can do to it is like the Kafkaesque solution, just blend it into a faceless bureaucracy, the basements of the National Archives, filed away with the a million other things, worthless and worthful and everything, lost in some giant warehouse to be locked up and never seen again. Genius thought process to end that film. And because of those touches and the fact that, they had the foresight to set it as a period piece. And so that you're not just finding the Ark of the Covenant, but you're finding it in the context, which of course is the symbol, not really so much of Christianity or Islam, although it's important to both faiths, but of Judaism in particular. And that you're fighting the Nazis to find it is a tremendous kind of like setup for that adventure. All of those elements put together make that film something more than the sum of its parts. And every imitation of it, including its own sequels, sort of lose that for like the more by the numbers kind of structure. Just like we'll go from A to B to C to D to E to ta-da, we found it, and the final conflict and the end.
So do you think there is value in because when I look at a film like National Treasure, and I agree with everything you said about Indiana Jones, and if anything, Indiana Jones follows that template that I mentioned, I think in our Superman review, where I felt like Last Crusade was a bit of a makeup for Temple of Doom, which Temple of Doom, when I was a kid, was probably my favorite. Now that I'm an adult, I sometimes struggle to sit through that one. And
I actually think Temple of Doom gets a bad rap. I've been convinced of that over time.
So when I'm being hard on Temple of Doom, and I love, if it's on, I'm watching it, but that doesn't mean that I don't find it problematic at points.
It's problematic. There's no doubt about that.
And I think I'm sort of jumping off topic here, but when I look at a film like National Treasure, you know, my impression of it, and you know, I can be critical of it, but that doesn't mean that I don't enjoy it. I did enjoy it, and what I enjoyed about it is I felt like if you compare it to another film that is formulaic and fairly shit, I felt like there was some attention and love that went into the making of this film. There was some, like, the filmmakers weren't making a paint by numbers film. I got the impression, and that was my impression going in when I read interviews with John Turteltaub. This was, I wouldn't say a passion piece, but something he was quite into making and wanted to hit certain areas and wanted to pay tribute to certain areas. And I felt like the film did a good job of doing that. And I really, it was just, I like to see how the canvas unfolded. And I will say, I thought Nicolas Cage in his character, I was quite happy with how he performed. It was understated. I think anytime Nicolas Cage is understated, I think he's good. I think he has the ability to be a good actor and just does an amazingly shit job in other films. And you know, with National Treasure, it is just an enjoyable, like you said, forget about it film. And I don't think, for me, I can punish it for some of its shortfalls, because there's other films that have those same shortfalls that I'm happy to look past.
I think I agree with most of what you just said.
I mean, we can disagree on. I totally get why you don't like why you find the film a bit too problematic. I get why.
Listen, I'm trying. You know, it's always fun to have a strident opinion,
and I probably am communicating more passion than I really feel. In some senses, I could just, you know, you're right. Nicolas Cage, outside of those first 20 minutes where I'm telling you, man, I was reaching for that remote. I'm like, oh no, I'm not doing this. But he calmed down. And you know, played right. The movie that kind of kept coming to mind for a similar sort of characterization, and it might have been interesting in some senses to let Nicolas Cage go a little bit more in some senses, like loosen the reins, but it would have taken different writing than what they were really doing. No, wait, hear me out. You ever see Conspiracy Theory?
Yes, Mel Gibson.
Right. And I thought the idea of, like, you know, someone who, like, think of Indiana Jones, but instead of being this suave, improbable, you know, swashbuckling archaeology professor,
crazy OCD nutbag. Yeah,
it's a crazy OCD nutbag that everybody's like, you know, but it just turns out he happens to have glommed onto the one thing that is in fact correct. Like there could have been something interesting about that. And it would have been an interesting, but you know, to me, like, frankly, and of course, Mel Gibson's a very problematic personality, and I haven't seen Conspiracy Theory since I saw it in the theaters in 1997. But I remember enjoying that film, actually, and enjoying that performance, and that, because that was essentially what that movie was about. Was that here's the guy who believes in every conspiracy theory you put underneath his nose, and that therefore makes him, you know, an unreliable person that everyone just sort of, you know, dismisses. No matter what he's saying, you have to think like, oh, there he goes again. And then of course he eventually falls into one that's real, you know, and that could have been an interesting way to make National Treasure a little bit. And I thought maybe that's where they were headed, especially in those opening scenes where he's trying to talk his way in to getting to see the Declaration of Independence and talking about how his family has been a bunch of rejects in the opening sequence where you meet him as like a little kid, I guess, which, by the way, I'm going to say a brief aside here. When I was watching that first scene where he's supposed to be at his grandfather's house or whatever with Christopher Plummer, right? And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, like, how old is like Nicolas Cage? Like, he must be, you know, because of the kid. I'm sitting there thinking, well, this kid is way too, like, young or too old to be playing Nicolas Cage at this age. I just remember thinking the ages were all wrong. And that's what made me look up how old he was when this movie was made. And it depressed me so much to find out he was 38 when this movie was made, because that means that can only mean one thing, Shawn, and it's not good. But having said all that, you know, I thought that they were kind of setting that up, like this idea of a character who was going to be sort of the laughing stock of his chosen profession, an outcast who's out to prove himself. I mean, all those elements are there, but there's not really a lot of follow through on it. Like, they set that up in the first half of the movie.
too capable to pull, like too, I guess. So that character, that's set up, and that's a really good point, because I think that's set up, and the way he plays that character is almost too debonair, too confident in himself to sort of drive that narrative.
Yeah, he's not nebbish enough. He's not, and the script doesn't really do him any favors, because they kind of drop the whole concept about halfway through. Like once they've swiped the Declaration of Independence, there's no more. There's an idea that he is running from the law, but like they kind of blow that up, because it's weirdly anticlimactic. Like this is what I mean. Like even on its own terms, it's not that good, because like there's the final showdown sorta with Sean Bean's character, Ian Howe. And then, they send him off. And I guess part of me wants to give him credit, because they give him that fake clue and he's going to run off to Boston. And I'm sitting there as I'm watching and thinking to myself, well, I've seen a movie before. He'll be back before the end of this film, having realized that, that clue was fake or whatever, and come back to try to take. But that never happens. You just kind of see them like up in Boston catching him and arresting him. Yeah. And I guess they wanted to set up a sequel where Sean Bean, I don't know if Sean Bean showed up in the
Sean Bean is not in it. He is, I think the idea is he's arrested and he's done, and that's it. They wanted so the end, and this is where it's so non-complicated, this film, because it's a tidy ending. They send Sean Bean to jail, they find the treasure, Ferrari in the end, everybody's happy.
Yeah,
it was a very
perfectly okay. He broke into the National Archives and stole the Declaration of Independence.
Well, and there was elements. If I go through the film, and when I watched it, and even my wife, who's very critical of film, she enjoys the film. And when we go through it, and I was watching those scenes, there was bits that I enjoyed the piece where they had the Constitution in the living room, and they were getting lemon on it, and John Voight doesn't realize it's the Constitution until he unveils it, and his reaction.
The Declaration of Independence, Shawn.
What did I say?
Constitution.
Oh shit! Damn. Yeah, thank you for calling me on that. But for me, it was almost like watching a good video game, or seeing a good video game unfold, and just see where all the different levels went. And
well, see, that's a really interesting. I didn't mean to interrupt, but go ahead.
No, I was gonna say it just reminded me of a really enjoyable video game where I enjoyed watching the film sort of just meander from point to point, because I do think the film does a good job of writing what is like, I don't know if I want to liken it to a song, or just sort of the way it meandered these clues. And yeah, of course it's fantasy, but I just really enjoyed how they wrote that sort of progression from clue to clue to clue. And this for me was, I think, I don't know, maybe it was just a bit of a guilty pleasure.
Well, you should feel guilty for liking this film. And I will say, though, that I think you really hit on something there. And I'm sorry I didn't come up with it myself, because I think you're exactly right. I think you hit the nail on the head. It is a video game film. Yeah. And in fact, I mean, for our audience, to what degree we have an audience, I'll reveal, I'll peek, like give everyone a peek behind the curtain, and that I was messaging Shawn as I began to watch this film. I'm sure you love the fact that your phone was going off at 4 a.m. or whatever in England. With my
read it the next day while I'm waiting for like customers to show up on phone calls at my job. I'm like, oh, Andrew's messaged me.
Well, I was watching it late at night here, so I assume it was like whatever time in the morning for you, but. The thing that was really jumping at me when I was watching it, and now that you say that and putting 2 and 2 together, I really think that what's interesting, because I've always kind of asked myself, is it because I just wasn't young in the 2000s, and so it doesn't hit me the same way, or is it because it truly didn't have a character, the 2000s? But where I'm going with this is like, if you say the 60s, everyone can kind of think there's a look to the 60s, not just there's fashions. There are things that, even though I didn't grow up in the 60s, that I know were sort of popular. And there's a way of making film in the 60s. And when I watch a movie with that, if you don't tell me what the decade is, I can often pick out, oh, this is a 60s movie. And certainly that's true with the 70s. And it's certainly true with the 80s. We all know, kind of have like the template of an 80s film in our minds. 90s, same thing. There's that Pulp Fiction, to me, is like the thing that introduced what became the 90s style.
Yeah.
But then the 2000s, to me, and again, this is a question: is it because I simply wasn't young and I kind of, I stopped being able to keep up with everything as I got busy with my life in the 2000s, or is it because the 2000s just never had a style that seemed its own or definitive? But if there is a 2000s style, I think like this movie is a very 2000s movie, and you saying this thing about video games kind of brings me back to it, because it is Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade in the video game. There was no video game. I mean, there were video games, of course. There were text adventure games. I have an old computer that's sitting behind me.
Temple of Doom was a popular video game.
It was a popular. In fact, I've played it. I have the Commodore 64 version, and
it's a very hard video game too.
It's extremely difficult. I've never gotten past the second screen. Yeah. Those mine carts are ridiculous. But what I mean is there's like, when we were growing up, video games in the 80s meant, 4 or 5 screens that repeated over and over again. And it was all purely physical. Like, could you navigate your way from the beginning of the screen to the end of the screen? And then Nintendo came along, and then there was an ending. Like, I mean, the earliest video games, like I had ColecoVision, right? Or Atari. They just repeated the same screens over and over again. They got gradually
Zelda
harder.
was very much like that, where it was from screen to screen to screen.
Right. But then Zelda and Super Mario Bros. Introduced the idea that there would be an end point you would get, and you would defeat the game, and of course video games took off from there, and they get more and more sophisticated. And by 2000, you're getting very sophisticated, both like things that could use like there used to be like text advantage. Did you ever play Zork when you were a kid? It was a Zork is like an adventure game, right? That's sort of like an Indiana Jones, like you're doing the thing, you're finding treasures, you're going from clue to clue to clue, right? But in the early days of video games, they couldn't put that together visually or animate, in any kind of sophisticated way. So they were using text. It's like interactive fiction. Then as computers get more sophisticated, you can add the video and all this. And so that by the time you get to like 2000, Myst, or like 1997, late 90s, Myst was sort of like, the first game that I remember being a combination of those text adventure games, the sophistication that came with those, plus the sophistication of modern computer video graphics and things. And National Treasure comes along in like 2004, 3. I think it's 2004. And it's really capitalizing on that aesthetic. So on the one hand, that's one thing that sort of marks it as a 2000s film. But the other thing that marked it as a 2000s film to me was, this is the era of George W. Bush, of post 9/11, of the jingoistic, highly, self-consciously patriotic. All of a sudden, when you and I were young and we were going to baseball games, they always did the national anthem before the baseball game. Then they started doing at the 7th inning stretch, God Bless America, every game after 9/11, because there was this hyper, the Patriot Act, all of that. This movie is just, it screams 2004 to me. It screams, that America's great, America, in ways that even today have started to fade a little bit.
And I think that's for me, that's where I might prefer this over some of the fantasy films that are out there, because so my wife would view, let's say, Harry Potter. So she looks at Harry Potter, a fantasy film, as she doesn't understand why people like it so much, because anybody could have written that. That's just a fantasy franchise that somebody, that seemed to catch on.
Well, and if anybody could have written it, how come anybody didn't? But
she would say that from her point of view, it's just popular culture took over, and it's just another wizard film, and it's very formulaic in her view, and there's nothing special about it. That's her view. I've not really watched it, not really been that into Harry Potter, don't know enough about it.
I have a friend who says the same thing about it, and there is a certain degree to which I understand this. Like, it's almost like, well, I mean, listen, this is Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces, right? It's what George Lucas did. He took that book, which Joseph Campbell was writing and working on almost contemporaneously to when George Lucas was coming up in the world, and said, I'm going to use, like, he's basically, what he's doing is doing what a good linguists do, or doing what good anthropologists do, and recognizing patterns that are cross-cultural and creating a master narrative, a distilled master narrative about the hero's journey. And then George Lucas comes along and then runs it the other way. I'm going to take this general template and create a specific thing out of it that I'm going to, basically go blow for blow. Okay, the hero is this young kid, blah, blah. And so it's all very generic, and it's all very... it's all very planned out, and it can feel like, if you know that that's what he's doing, it can feel very like manipulative, almost like you're just taking a template that some brilliant person through years of research was able to put together, and you're just basically, you know, painting by numbers here. You know, you're just filling in the blanks. But on the other hand, lots and lots of people try to do it because especially once George Joseph Campbell came along and did that, lots and lots of people have tried to, you know, replicate it, because the idea is that the narrative is somehow elemental to the human condition, that it always resonates with people, but it still takes it being well done. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's really what it boils down to.
But I think when you compare the way this film was written, and you take that formulaic sort of structure that you were talking about, I think for me, I look at this as a bit more like a Tex-Mex style of writing, because you're taking something and you're not just going with, okay, you know, this person has superpowers and this person's a kid and, you know, realizes their potential and blah, blah, blah. This actually takes things in history, things that actually happened in history, and connects them and evolves them into a fantasy story. Mm-hmm. And I think for me, I think that takes a little bit more craft than just, let's say, you know, creating a war film or creating a fantasy film. And I think I give it a little bit of credit for that, because it's not just going down the normal route of fantasy film. It's adding a historical twist to it. And I can't think of many films that have done that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I haven't really thought about it too. I mean, the historical fiction is a well-established genre. Is it combined with like
historical fantasy, though? Think about it. I'm not talking about historical.
Well, I mean, Indiana Jones, like we started this by saying it's a copy of Indiana Jones' The Last Crusade, except that it's set in America. But I mean, you know, like it is, right? I mean, like you take some basic ish facts. I mean, well, I want to say they're basic. There aren't a whole lot of facts going on in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
But Indiana Jones is using, if you're not a religious person, is using the supernatural world of religion, whereas this is using a leaping off point of actual fact. The Silence Dogood letters were a thing. Benjamin Franklin actually wrote that as a child or as a teenager. And the references.
I was actually wondering that. I didn't look that up. So those are real. He did.
Those are so. There's actually when you look up the historical accuracy of the film, and some of the conclusions it goes to are leaps for the sake of the storyline, but the leaping off points are accurate. So the symbology on the back of $100 bill, it actually says 222 on the back, and so, you know, a lot of the context and a lot of the one thing I think that's not accurate is I think the Declaration of Independence is pretty much.
We are having technical difficulties, everyone. Nope, we still can't hear Shawn. Shawn, can't hear you.
Hold on.
All right, you're back. You're back.
Sorry about that. I got so excited about this amazing.
Cut his own mic off, or maybe I did it, or maybe the people, maybe the Knights Templar or the Masons did it to prevent you from revealing the secrets of this film. But go on, 222.
But the leaping off points in this film. If you were to look at the historical inaccuracy, it hasn't really invented a lot of things. It was off. I think some of the things were off by like 10 years. Something said, well, it wasn't 1889, it was 1879. But when you look up the historical accuracy of the film, as far as the jumping off points, it's accurate. It said we're gonna start from a historical foundation that we know can be referenceable, and then we're gonna build this story off from here. And that for me, I that was something that I enjoyed. I like that connection to history, and it is definitely a bias point for me because of where we grew up. You know, my brother, you weren't at my brother's wedding.
No,
my brother, he had his reception in the Franklin Institute. And that film, even then, like that film was, you know, what was it on display? Was it the Silence Dogood letters on display in the Franklin Institute? Yeah. You know, that took place, you know, in a place that we've spent years going in and out of. And for me, that was something.
Well, I mean, Shawn, I enjoy that aspect of it, but I got to separate my aesthetic judgment from my personal feeling of, nostalgia fix. So, for example, I mean, if I were going to draw an analogous thing, you know, that movie Invincible about Vince Papale. You know, I mean, there isn't a thing about that movie that's not meant to press my particular buttons. And as a Philadelphia Eagles fan, right? It's about the guy from the neighbor. Movie's terrible. It's absolutely flat terrible.
I don't think it's a good film, but I'll watch it. I won't. I probably.
Well, of course I will, because it's like it's the Eagles movie. Of course I'm gonna watch it. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like if it comes on the TV, of course I'm looking at it. It's dumb. And it's not even well constructed for the kind. I mean, that's a formula movie if ever there were a formula movie.
Oh, that to me is so. But that to me is, if we were to compare that to Disney movie as well, that to me is an example of a lazy film that's just so like easy to make, and it's so predictable.
Oh, I'll say this: National Treasure is a damn sight better than Invincible. If you wanted to do like the relative scale of Philadelphia, like Philly porn, movies that are like just feature a lot of Philadelphia and make me feel happy to be looking at films.
M. Night Shyamalan films.
Haven't seen them all.
So I would say they get a little bit more charity from me because of where they're based. I think M. Night's affinity towards the local area he gets some brownie points for me, and he doesn't deserve them, but he gets them because of that.
Well, that's where you and I differ. I mean, are we talking about would I watch it for fun myself? But what's the purpose of our discussion here? Is it for me to tell people, hey, you should watch National Treasure because it's a good movie? Yeah. Or is our purpose here to say, like, listen, National Treasure is a shaky movie at best, but if you like Philadelphia and you haven't been to the Independence Hall or Franklin Institute in a while, and maybe you live out of town and you want to see those places, this is as fun a way as possible. This is a fun way to see them. Yeah. Sure,
I think I'm more giving a reference as to maybe trying to understand why, because I don't disagree with your points on what makes it a quote shaky film, but at the same time, if I were to sit there and look at this film in isolation, I wasn't bored at any point watching it the sixth or seventh time or however much I've seen it. So it's not as if
I wasn't bored, and I will say that's the best thing I can say for this film. And it's not. And it sounds like maybe like a semi-cut, but it's not really an insult. I mean, like a lot of movies are boring. This movie is not boring, and that's the worst thing that a movie can be. Really.
And I would say, from a Nicolas Cage standpoint, I would say he does well in this film, and he is somebody who has. Oh man, if we were to go down Face Off, that was. Oh man!
Well, you know what I think I'm learning here is that Nicolas Cage. The problem with him is he has no idea how to modulate himself. He's either obnoxious Nicolas Cage, or he's underdone Nicolas Cage. And I agree that this is not obnoxious Nicolas Cage that I'm watching. But as a result, I think that things that the movie could have done that would have made it a little bit more interesting are not done because I don't know if it's a directorial choice, like we don't want obnoxious Nicolas Cage anywhere near this, so we're going to tell him, hey, tone it down. And as a result, like I said, I don't think the script does a good job of following through, particularly on something that they spend a lot of effort to set up in the first half of the film, but then doesn't seem to be that important in the second half. I don't know how. Like, I'm thinking about how would you do this? Certainly a little bit more. I mean, she's skeptical at first. And of course she has to get drawn in. I mean, that's gotta be, I get that. I mean, that's gotta be, because she is in some senses a stand-in for the audience, but his performance is kind of under on that point. And the FBI is Harvey Keitel's way too immediately forgiving of the entire thing. You know what I mean? Like, it's just too like, oh yeah, it's fine, or I could see you're telling us the truth or whatever. I don't know. And it's,
isn't he's a Freemason, and he identifies that Nicolas Cage is following the same values actually that he has, and Harvey Keitel is bright enough to see through you're just a criminal stealing the Declaration of Independence.
Maybe that's it. And by the way, I have an aside here that I was thinking as I was watching this film, because Freemasons are always at the center of all these conspiracies. People thinking about Freemasons and thinking that they're right up there. And please, for my audience, take this under advisement because I'm the furthest thing. I don't mean to sound it, but like they're right up there with the Jews in the way that people conspire. There's secret conspiracies being run by the Freemasons. The Jews are running. Like none of this is true. People. But at the same time, just to this point, like the Freemasons, like here's the real truth of the Freemasons, like right now in the Philadelphia, well, not so much this year, but I remember last year when I was driving around the Philadelphia area on the radio, the Freemasons were having to, this is really 2 years ago, I was down in Washington, D.C. Freemasons were having to advertise on the radio, like, hey, join the Freemasons. This is this big secret society that's got to get on the radio and like hustle for membership because the Baltimore Freemasons apparently couldn't draw anybody in. Which, by the way, I think is a segue to, because to me, what's interesting, and again, the 2000s, I think that I never thought about whether or not the 2000s had a style, but this is the first movie like that I've ever watched and said to myself, this is like a 2000s movie. Like this is what like this is starting to say something to me about the style of the 2000s. It's got the video game sort of plot setup, you know, where it feels a little bit like that, like you're playing one of those types of computer games, PC based games with a lot of, you know, follow the clues, get to the thing, do the thing, you know, all this. And it's so much of its moment with the jingoistic stuff and the America, 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 rah, 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 rah. But it also has this conspiracy theory element, which we've talked about prior to starting this recording, which I think, you know, along with the Da Vinci Code, which I have never seen, but I certainly know what it's about, to me kicks off this, because it's really in the 2000s and the explosion of like things like the Discovery Channel and whatnot, that you start like Ancient Aliens, and you start to see like the mainstreaming of these weird and more out there conspiracies about, you know, oh, there's no way ancient people could have built the pyramids without help from outer space. Oh, there's no way that, you know, people could have done Easter Island without help from outer space, or the Freemasons are somehow controlling everything. And of course, the idea of blaming Freemasons and Jews, as I've already said, and other groups, Knights Templar, certain secret Catholic societies, for various societies, either, you know, secret things that they're doing or ills, that's as old as dirt, but it's getting more and more mainstreamed. And to me, it leads to the present moment where it really leads to the Donald Trump era. You know, where there's this kind of, think about it, it's jingoistic, it's all patriotic, but at the same time, it's, you know, which Donald Trump is, you know, America first in spades and about everything America, blah, 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 blah. But it's also this weird kind of, you know, it's relatively positive about the Masons. I assume that they had to get some kind of clearance from the Masons for this film to use their name as clearly as they do. But it's, I don't know. I mean, to me, it starts off, or it implies where we are today. Like you're seeing the seeds, the germs of this.
I would say in the 2000s, the 2000s, and to be fair, I'm Googling here the films. I would say that this film is specifically representative of like 2000, because I would say the style of the decade is a little bit more gritty and a little bit more, I don't know. I think 2000s when film started to kind of go away from that sort of genre of formulaic Hollywood. You know, you're starting to see some films coming in. Like if you look at, I'm just looking at a list of films here that are quite popular. You know, you see films like Napoleon Dynamite doing well. You know, a really low budget MTV film, or Castaway, which is a very big Hollywood Tom Hanks film that is, you know, making what is largely a good film with very little script and a lot of cinematography and a lot of, you know, sound effect. Whereas this film is a very formulaic Disney Cool Running style film that, you know, you don't have to think at all. Just looking through the films, I mean, this is when we see things like The Departed, just going through a list here, The Lovely Mr. Bones, Taken. Well, Taken. That's, I didn't realize there was a Taken 3 until this weekend, by the way.
There's a Taken 3. I think I heard that. I've never seen any of them, because, like, I mean, that's the oldest joke about those movies, right? Like, at what point do people does not get the picture? Don't fuck with this dude. Like, there was some really interesting films, and every film I'm looking at, if I look at the top films in 2000, this film is very different than a lot of the films that were largely popular during this period. And to me, this almost represents an ending of an era, this National Treasure, when it came out. Because I think from mid 2000s onward, film changed quite a bit. If you know, just looking at what's come out. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking about like your basic premise here. I'm looking at the top grossers of the years of the 2000 decade, and I'm trying to see like what trends do I spot. You know, I see Avatar, The Lord of the Rings, Pirates of the Caribbean. I mean, to me, to a certain extent, this is like, you think about the 90s and what the top grossers were, especially the latter half of the 90s. that's the end of the period. So maybe this is a movie that's really represents more a transition from the 90s to 2000s, because the end of the 90s was the end of the period where Hollywood would spend a lot of money on unestablished properties. So, you know, like Independence Day, Men in Black, all those disaster films that were so well. I mean, you know, we went, what's it? The one with Bruce Willis that you and I went to see that was so stupid.
Armageddon.
Armageddon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was bad.
I mean, like a million of those types of movies, and then they just stopped making those. And I'm looking at 2000s, and you know, Avatar is the top grossing film of the 2000s, which is interesting. It grossed.
I thought it was a serviceable film. I was never that nuts about it. Avatar.
Well, you know, James Cameron, I've actually never seen it. I was going to see it, then I heard it was only so.
It was fine.
James Cameron is like, you know, the king of, if ever you want to make $500 million, you call up James Cameron and he will get it done for you. You know, whether the movie's any good or not, he knows what people like. I got to give it to him.
Yeah.
But you know, everything else outside of Avatar, The Lord of the Rings, Pirates of the Caribbean, The Dark Knight, Harry, of course, that was, it was 2008.
It's the
Harry
decade
Potter.
of the blockbuster, wasn't it?
Well, what I'm seeing is stuff based on established properties, except actually Shrek was a book. I didn't realize this, but Shrek was a children's book. Shrek 2. Anyway, Shrek 2 is the top grosser, not Shrek. Shrek 2 and Shrek the third, they both made more money than the original. So, you know, they're sequels that are whatever. Spider-Man, Transformers, Star Wars, Finding Nemo, and Avatar, the only two here in the top 20 that are, you know, based that are somehow original to film, which is interesting to me. Because I think of, you know, National Treasure, I'll give it that. Like, it is its own thing. You know, it's not based on anything. And
because this is around the same time. I don't know if you ever saw the film Holes.
No.
It's actually not. I'd be curious to get your take on that at some point. It's with what is his name? The young actor who is in the last Indiana Jones film. Crazy guy. What's his name?
Denholm, John Rhys Davies.
No. It is. The
last Indiana Jones film. Shia LaBeouf. Yeah.
So this is. I'll share the screen so you can see who. See if you recognize it. But this was an interesting time for Disney films. This was when zoom in a bit if I can.
Okay.
This was I think a year before National Treasure came out. And Disney was going down this more of a fantasy, you know, bit sort of out of left field type film for them. And that was an interesting one that came out at about that time. I think Disney was doing some interesting things early 2000s.
Yeah, I've never heard of this movie.
It's I need to watch it again because I remember watching it with I think like a young cousin. You know, just I was babysitting. And I remember thinking, this film is ridiculous. And then I thought, yeah, I'm enjoying, you know, like it was one of those ones I was weirdly enjoying. It was good, and I couldn't figure out why I was enjoying it. It wasn't an amazing story. It was John Voight again. I think he was one of the main characters.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, Sigourney Weaver. Yeah.
It wasn't bad. It was all right.
Well, I mean, good. You know, I have to say, I'm a little perturbed that my whole premise has sort of been shot to shit here, because I'm looking at, like, I have to say, National Treasure doesn't really fit in with the top 20 grossers.
Yeah. No disrespect. I didn't mean to raise that, but I felt like it had to be raised when I started looking at the list, and I thought, I think you make a good point that this film is very unique for. I think the 2000s, early 2000s, is a very unique time. Because, you know, I think at that time, that transition from late 90s to early 2000s, I think this film really does cap off a very weird time transitioning from what is late 90s to 2000s.
Yeah, I'm now rearranging it just to see what were the top grossers from 2000 to 2, because I've rearranged the list. So that 2004, The Day After Tomorrow. So every movie I'm about to name is from 2004 or earlier. From
Day After Tomorrow is that is a fairly shit film. What's
And
that?
that's a James Bond movie, is it not?
No. Isn't that the Day After Tomorrow is the
Oh,
apocalyptic film
oh, it's
with
another one of the disaster, which that is the end of the '90s, right? Because
yeah,
those disaster films, like, so that's
like
interesting.
Volcano kicked it off with Pierce Brosnan, and it finished with what's his name, Jake Gyllenhaal, isn't it, in Day After Tomorrow, and Dennis Quaid.
Let's see. It says, wow, your memory's good. That's right, Dennis
Yeah.
Quaid, Jake Gyllenhaal. I never saw this one.
Well, I
Interesting.
like because I live with a scientist slash engineer who
Mhm.
who gets a giggle out of Volcano and The Day After Tomorrow, and that is a film we most certainly have to discuss.
Well, you know what we should do that with, because I started to watch once, and I was so amused by. I have a thing about tornadoes. Okay, I am
Twister?
Yeah, I'm afraid of tornadoes, so I'm interested in them.
even though I don't live anywhere near where a tornado is ever seriously going to happen, I have dreams about them from time to time. There's some innate fear I have of a tornado, even though it's not plausible that I'll be ever caught in a tornado as long as I live in this area. And so one time, and like, I find them fascinating. So I started to watch Twister, and the very premise, the setup of the film, where there's like the good tornado chasing team, and then there's the evil tornado chasing team, just made me laugh so much.
Well, it's almost like you know how you watch like Murder, She Wrote and Columbo, and they have the same actors that they're sharing. This has the same sort of supporting cast that's in every one of these types of films, and they're always the fun-loving, crazy, outcast, lovable, storm chasing crazy guys. And it's very and with Day After Tomorrow, and we're gonna have to wrap up here in a bit. But with Day After Tomorrow, all of these films, it's just and this is a good point for me to really connect why I like National Treasure, is it's not trying to be something it's not. It's just a fun film that's unapologetic and it does its thing. Whereas these types of films, they're just ridiculous, and they're trying to pull off some level of plausibility, and it's stupid. It's absolutely stupid. It's ridiculous, and they're trying to make it make it work, so to speak, with a lot of these films. And I think that's where that differentiation point is National Treasure's fantasy, and it accepts its fantasy. Twister is creating ridiculous characters and is completely implausible, but it doesn't act like it's implausible. It doesn't act like a fantasy. It acts like a real film that's an adventure. It's ridiculous.
I have to say, and I'm not really big into special effects, or like they're not the thing that I was like, ooh, I want to go see. That's the thing about Twister, I think, that gets me. It's like, wow, to see what like a tornado might look like. You know what I mean? Like a staged, but very realistic looking inside of a tornado. But this is another thing for another day.
I think, yeah. And I would say that Twister, that film in comparison to Day After Tomorrow is much better. I don't think it's an offensive film. I think Day After Tomorrow is an offensive film.
Oh, so all right. So we should check that out. The Volcano. Yeah. We could do a disaster film day.
Ooh, we should do a ranking of disaster films. We should get like a series of like 4 of them, and that, or rank our.
What's the one where Morgan Freeman's the president, I think, and a meteor's coming or something like that? I don't think I ever saw
Deep Impact.
One. Deep
Impact is like the thoughtful version of Armageddon.
What an interesting idea.
Well, I think we need to finish up here and give ourselves a score. So I thought about this, and I'm going in the 7s, the low 7s. I'm going 7.2 for my National Treasure score. I think it's perfectly serviceable. I've enjoyed it multiple times, and yes, you're right. Everything about it is ridiculous, but I love it.
I have to say, you've made me feel more charitable. And you know what's making me feel more charitable is this list. Because I'm looking at it. Well, I mean, again, I got to give it credit. The only other movie, even in the early 2000s, is The Matrix Reloaded. That's something we should do an episode about.
I just think there's a bit of style to this. And maybe that's what it is. And maybe you're helping me realize it because I'm trying to defend my point. There's some sort of a style to it that's just like it's owning itself a bit. It's original in some respects.
It stands out more among this crew of films, although I notice it is itself not on the list. So it didn't do, I mean, it did fine business, but it didn't do like earth-shattering.
It's a lot more successful in syndication, I guess. I don't know if that's what you would call it, but I think it actually does well in sort of making money after the fact.
I'm glad for Nicolas Cage. I'm sure he enjoys those residuals.
He deserves it. Of course.
Yeah. I mean, gee, what to say about it? I guess as a movie, I would give it like a 5.
I'm happy to hear you hit the 5s. I thought you were going 4s.
Well, because as you say, it is. I think I said it earlier. It's inoffensive. You know what I mean? Like, it's fine for what it is.
Yeah.
And it's more fine for what it is than I expected. And that's probably because Nicolas Cage is under, as you say, it's an understated performance. I actually think that it could have benefited from someone who had the range, but I think Nicolas Cage only has 2 speeds. Either I'm not really trying that hard because I've been told not to, because I get real annoying when I do, or I'm really hamming it up, and really hamming it up. Nicolas Cage, Face Off. What's that?
Man.
What's that one that everybody Leaving Las Vegas? That movie that movie offends me. That movie actually offends me.
I don't know that I remember that film too well. You're not talking about Fear and Loathing.
No. Leaving Las Vegas. He plays an alcoholic, and it's supposed to be like this really good thing. It was like a prestige kind of film, and it he's whatever. And well, the whole plot is just, it's male fantasy. Like, of course he meets a beautiful hooker. He's basically trying to drink himself to death, or drink and or commit suicide over a weekend in Las Vegas. And of course he meets a beautiful hooker who just is terribly fascinated with this middle-aged drunk. You know what I mean? Like, it's male fantasy. And so it's even the plot is just like, this is just, when people talk about white privilege, I think this is what they mean, is that like anybody, anywhere, like in the minds of certain men, they think that it's real fascinating that they're drunk and, poets on the inside. Fuck you. But, you know what I mean? Like, but having said that, and that's Nicholas, this one, he is understated. That probably helps the film versus what would have been the opposite, but I think the film could have been better if it had been someone else. So there we are, 5.
So we're at a 6.1 collectively. So sadly
so.
For you and sadly for me, we've had to find a score that we probably both don't agree with, but collectively represents our channel view. So National Treasure gets a 6.1, my friend.
All right, 6.1 it is.
Well, again, thank you, everybody. And I think next week we're going to be touching on vaccines and more to come, or anti-vaxxers, which is Dixon's favorite subject. So anyway, to everybody who joined in, thanks for tuning in. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe. And thank you to our first subscriber. I don't know who that is, but we have a first subscriber. So let's keep it rolling. So this is me from Shawn. Take care. And Andrew, have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.